The Chosen Season 5 is about to release, and there are definitely some things you need to know before you see it. So many key events happened in Season 4, and each of them is going to have a major impact on what's coming in Season 5. The real reason behind John's death, the argument between Jesus and the Pharisees, the reconciliation between Matthew and Peter, and most importantly, the tears that Jesus sheds at the end of Episode 4. All of these are going to play a pivotal role in this upcoming season, and let me show you why. Starting with John's death. Because if we don't understand why John was really executed, we'll never understand what's about to happen to Jesus. In Episode 1, we see the depiction of an important moment in the Gospels that describes the death of John the Baptist at the hands of Herod Antipas. Antipas orders John to be beheaded at the request of the daughter of his wife Herodias after she pleases him with a dance. But the reason behind John's death goes far beyond an irresponsible promise and a mother's conspiracy. John's death is connected to Jesus himself. You see, what's interesting about Herod Antipas is that his power didn't extend very broadly. He wasn't the king of all Israel. He wasn't even a king of Jerusalem. In fact, he wasn't even really a king at all. The more accurate description of this Herod is the title that we find in Matthew and Luke's Gospels, Tetrarch. And this is because when his father, Herod the Great, died, the same Herod who ordered all of the young males to be killed when Jesus was born, when he died, his lands were redistributed by Rome. In some of the land, Rome actually installed their own governors, and in other parts, they gave them to Herod's sons. Antipas was in charge of the regions of Galilee and Perea. And since Galilee is where most of Jesus' ministry occurs, this is why we see Herod Antipas so prominently in the Gospels. This fact also gives us context for the conflict between Herod and John. John performed his ministry along the Jordan. He too crossed into Herod's territory. And in a passage from Mark's Gospel, we learn of the events that will ultimately lead to John's death. John is upset because Herod is marrying a woman named Herodias. But the real question is, why does this upset him so much? And the answer to that is actually fairly complex. You see, when Herod decides to marry Herodias, he's actually already married. And so is Herodias. Herodias is the wife of his brother Philip, who is also a tetrarch. So for Herod to marry Herodias, not only must he divorce his wife, and not only must Herodias leave her husband, causing both of them to commit adultery. Additionally, Herodias is his niece, the daughter of his brother Aristobulus. And then finally, this betrayal is ultimately going to lead to armed conflict between Herod's armies and the armies of his former wife's father, Aretas, costing innocent people their lives. This is a moral disaster on many levels. It will harm people far beyond those involved. It highlights the immorality of those in power, those leading this nation. And ultimately, it's something John will forfeit his life to resist. But here's the thing. That's the story on the surface. But then there's also the deeper meaning here, the subtle narrative that impacts Jesus, the real reason that John is killed, and that Jesus should watch out for his own life. You see, just before Mark tells us this story about Herod, he tells us about some rumors spreading about Jesus. People are asking the question, who is this man really? And several ideas are floated. Some say that one of the prophets has come back, others say that John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and some say Elijah, just like they said about John. But there's more to this rumor about Jesus than simply thinking a prophet has returned. This is meant to show us how Jesus was viewed by the people around him. And more importantly, this is meant to indicate how Jesus was viewed by Herod and others in positions of power. Jesus was a threat, one claiming to be the rightful king to the throne of Israel, and one who was no friend of Herod and the religious leaders. In fact, one of Jesus' most powerful condemnations against the religious leaders is when he says, "Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them." And who were these religious leaders that Jesus is condemning, conspiring with in Mark's Gospel just a few chapters ago? The Herodians. You see, the last time there was even a reference to Herod's name was when the religious leaders and the Herodians were plotting together to kill Jesus. And then when you add to this the fact that the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that Herod executed John not just because of the situation with Herodias, but because John had become too popular, well, what becomes clear is that John was a threat, and so is Jesus. You see, at the time, people believed that the Messiah was going to be a great warrior king who would kick people like Herod out of Israel and return the land to God's people. Herod the Great wanted to put an end to Jesus' life for this very reason when Jesus was born. And when we look closer at Scripture, we can see that his son eventually does too. But Herod won't be the only one wanting to put an end to Jesus' life in season 5. One particular rabbi will do whatever it takes to quiet Jesus, especially after the way Jesus humiliated him in season 4. While Jesus is preaching, Rabbi Akiva appears and begins to attack Jesus' words and credibility. And at one point, Jesus responds with the words we see in Matthew 23 and Luke 11, where he says, "You Pharisees, you cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, and then you eat and drink food that goes into the body, that inside is full of greed and wickedness. You fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean." Now, just on the surface, the tone of these words is obvious. They are harsh and scathing. But when we look closer, we find that there is even deeper meaning in Jesus' condemnation. For instance, Jesus begins by saying that these Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but that their bodies are full of greed and wickedness. Well, throughout Scripture, the word cup doesn't just refer to the cup itself, but also the contents of the cup. It's also a word that Jesus has used in Matthew to refer to his suffering. And similarly, the reference to the dish may have brought to mind the platters inside of the temple, reminders of the platters donated by each of the 12 tribes for the tabernacle, platters which would have at that time been used to collect the blood of temple sacrifices. And all of this would have helped them recognize Jesus' greater point. They, these religious leaders, are the cup and the platter. Just as a cup represents what's inside of it, just as a platter reminds them of its greater purpose, Jesus is trying to remind these religious leaders that it is not their rituals and traditions that make them clean and holy. Only the Lord can make things holy. And by forgetting that, they've forgotten who they are. Their insides are unclean. They've gone from holy instruments to men filled with greed and wickedness. But what's interesting here is that the actual word Jesus uses for wickedness in Matthew's gospel is the word akrasia, which actually means a lack of self-control. And this really brings out the irony of the whole situation. To this group who prides themselves on their self-control and being able to follow the laws and the traditions, Jesus says, yes, you can do that, but you've really lost self-control over what really matters. You've lost self-control when it comes to your hearts, your thoughts, your treatment of others. In this, you've strayed greatly. And then quickly after that, Jesus makes his next condemnation. As he concludes his criticism of their view of clean and unclean, Jesus mentions giving alms, to which the religious leader, Rabbi Akiva, argues that they tithe everything so that the poor can benefit, down to the smallest plants in their garden. And again, this is coming directly from Matthew 23 and Luke 11. Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you pay a tenth of mint and dill and cumin and neglect the more important matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. It was necessary to do these things while not neglecting those, blind guides who filter out a gnat and swallow a camel." Now, the interesting thing here is that the religious leaders are actually following the law by tithing these small things. Leviticus 27 says, "A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord." Now, there was some debate as to how small of a plant you needed to tithe, and as we can see here, the religious leaders have decided to be as strict as possible so that they don't accidentally disobey this command. But what Jesus is doing here is helping them to see that they've missed the greater point. You see, at the time of Jesus, they broke the law up into two types of commandments. Mitzvot kalot, which refers to light commandments. These were things that, to a certain degree, were less important. They didn't carry the same weight as mitzvot chamarot. Mitzvot chamarot referred to heavy or serious commandments. These were major commands that you absolutely must follow. They were central, serious commands. And what Jesus is suggesting here is that the religious leaders have sacrificed the heavy commands in order to observe the light ones. This is what he means when he mentions justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These are the big commands. They are at the heart of the law. But the religious leaders are ignoring them. It's also why he says that they filter the gnat but swallow the camel. They're paying close attention to the small things, but totally ignoring the big ones. Because once again, they've become misguided. Their focus is on the wrong things, and this really helps us to get at the heart of the tension between Jesus and the religious leaders. So often, we're told that the religious leaders accuse Jesus of breaking the law, or that Jesus tells us that we don't need the law. But if you look closely, that's not the case at all. Earlier in Matthew's Gospel, during Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And those phrases, abolish the law and fulfill the law, are actually idioms. To abolish the law was a Jewish way of saying that you interpreted it incorrectly. And to fulfill the law meant that you interpreted it correctly. So what Jesus is saying is that he hasn't come to misinterpret Scripture, he's come to interpret it correctly. And this gets at the source of their tension with each other. The religious leaders don't think that Jesus is doing away with the law. They think that he's misinterpreting it. And they think that he's spreading these misinterpretations, which is exactly how Jesus feels about them. Throughout this entire scene, Jesus has been outlining how he thinks the religious leaders have abolished the law, interpreted it wrong. And their biggest misinterpretation of all is him. Their Messiah is standing right in front of them, and they want nothing to do with him. A blind man put his faith in Jesus after seeing nothing, but these men, who have seen so much, can't even muster the faith of the Ninevites and the Queen of Sheba. And that's because in the end, their hearts aren't searching for a Messiah who will restore their hearts and reveal to them what God truly wants. What they're looking for is a warrior who will remove the Romans, a Messiah who will get rid of all of these outside influences and allow them to return Israel to the type of nation who worships God in the way they deem best. And yet, while the religious leaders seek violence, two of Jesus' disciples finally experience reconciliation. Before that though, if you love these insights into The Chosen and would like to dive even deeper, check out my best-selling book, The Forgotten Teachings of Jesus. In this book, I dive deep into season 1 of The Chosen and reveal things about the world of Jesus that will not only change the way you watch every season of the show, they're also going to change the way you read the Bible. So if you'd like to learn more about the book, and if you'd like to receive some exclusive bonuses when you order, just go to www.brandonrobbinsministry.com/book. You'll find a link up above and down in the description. And now, back to more things you're going to want to know before seeing season 5 of The Chosen. Ever since the campfire scene in season 2, we've known that there was incredible tension between Peter and Matthew. In fact, you could probably even call it hatred. Matthew had worked for Rome as a tax collector and was just a day away from calling all of Peter's debts in and stripping his family from everything they had. After all this time, Matthew has finally apologized to Peter, but Peter isn't ready to accept it. And when Peter comes to Jesus about it, Jesus tells him to forgive Matthew not just 7 times for 7 of the terrible things Matthew did to him, but to forgive him 77 times or 70 times 7 times. Now, this is one of those moments where it's really great to look up the scripture that The Chosen uses for this scene and to explore what else is going on in that particular passage. Because while the show did not quote everything else that happens after Jesus says these words, it definitely seems to have used them. You see, in Matthew 18, after Jesus tells Peter to forgive 77 times, meaning limitless forgiveness, he tells a parable. He says, "For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man, a king, who wanted to settle accounts with his slaves. And when he began to settle them, someone was brought to him who owed 10,000 talents." Now, to Jesus' audience, this is an insane amount of debt. 10,000 talents is the equivalent to roughly 150,000 years worth of wages. It is impossible to overcome. Which, of course, naturally makes us think, who else had a debt that seemed impossible to overcome? Peter. There was no way he was going to cover his tax debt. Even though he didn't deserve it, Jesus saved him from this huge debt, which makes what happens next in the parable even more interesting. Because in the parable, the king has mercy on this slave. He frees him from this debt. But then the slave does something awful. He finds someone who is indebted to him, and he shows no mercy, no grace, none of the goodness that he himself just received. Which is exactly what Peter's doing to Matthew. Matthew owes Peter a great debt, He did him terrible harm, and honestly, there is nothing that Matthew can do to repay that. Nothing he can do to ever make up for all of the harm he caused Peter and his family. And what Jesus is saying is, he doesn't have to. None of us has to. That's the beauty of grace. It can't be earned. It can't be deserved. It is God's gift to us, God's gift to Peter. And it's the gift that Peter needs to give to Matthew. No doubt, this is a moment that brought Jesus to tears, one where he saw the gospel unfold in two of his disciples. But there's also another moment that brought Jesus to tears for another reason. Because as Jesus sees Zebedee and the others crushing olives for their new business, he isn't crying tears of joy. He's weeping because of what he knows is coming. You see, olives were a critical part of life in Israel. They were used as food and in religious life, and the process of producing olive oil was especially important in the Gospels. After olives had been picked, they would be crushed with a stone. Olives would be placed in a basin, and a large stone would be pushed around in a circle to break open the olives and begin to draw forth the oil. And then after that, the olives would be taken to a press. This was a series of large stones used to press down onto the olives and draw forth even more of the oil. The oil would be collected in basins and placed in clay jars. In fact, olives would be pressed 3 times in order to draw forth all of the oil. And as Jesus watches this process unfold, he can't contain his emotion because Jesus realizes that these olives represent him. You see, throughout Scripture, after Jesus goes to Caesarea Philippi, his ministry begins to take a dark turn. He turns his face to Jerusalem, and his path of suffering begins. As Jesus looks at these olives, he realizes that just as they are crushed, he too will be crushed. Jesus' last moments will be spent in a place called Gethsemane. In Hebrew, geth is the word for olive, and semene is the word for press. Gethsemane isn't just an olive grove, it's where the olives are pressed. And as Jesus spends his final hours with his disciples that night, he is pressed upon constantly. Just as olives are pressed 3 times, Jesus goes off to pray 3 times, feeling the pressure upon him. In fact, Luke tells us that just as the oil runs forth from the olives, Jesus' heart was much troubled, and he prayed all the more. Water ran from his face like blood and fell to the ground. You see, in Israel, kings were anointed with oil as part of their coronation, but here, Jesus is anointed in his suffering, soon to be crowned with thorns, sacrificed for all. And throughout it all, he is so alone. You see, as Jesus looks at this press, he isn't just broken because of the suffering ahead of him. He's mourning the fact that he will be doing all of this alone, that his disciples can't drink from the cup that he will drink, suffer the pain that he will suffer. They don't get it yet. When he suffers in the garden, they will fall asleep. When he's taken away as a prisoner, they will run. And the realization of this path that lies before him is agonizing. Terrible things are coming in season 5. And now that we've looked back at season 4, we're ready to experience them to their fullest. Well, that's it for this episode of The Chosen Explained. Now, if you enjoyed this video, you're going to love my book, The Forgotten Teachings of Jesus. You can learn all about it and get special bonuses just by clicking the link above and down in the description. And if you'd like to see another video that will prepare you to see season 5 of The Chosen, just click this link right here. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.